Hey there, everybody. Stuart here. Just wanted to jump in before the podcast gets going and just let you know that in this conversation that I have with Nick Winkelman, who's the head of athletic development over with Irish Rugby, we had a few issues with the sound quality. We had a bit of a sketchy internet feed, so it's not probably as good as it can be, but it's worth persevering through because the actual conversation itself was really enjoyable, and I think you'll get an awful lot out of it. So sorry for that, but hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Right, well, welcome back to the Talent Equation podcast. After, I think, what has been a really serious test of our resilience, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Nick Winkelman to the show. Nick, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Stuart. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, we've definitely been round the houses technologically, and we've persevered through, and now we're finally getting to have a conversation. So it's been a long time coming, and Nick, I've been sort of watching your travels around the globe, but also I first met you when you came over very kindly and presented at a conference when I was working at the RFU, working in rugby, one of our player development conferences, and I remember having my eyes open to the stuff you talk about and the stuff you do with physical development. But before we jump into all of that, I wonder if you could kind of tell everybody your backstory and how you've arrived where you are now.
Yeah, well, my background really is in, as you alluded to there, Stuart, strength and conditioning. I've been a strength and conditioning coach for roughly the last 15 years. I currently work for Irish Rugby, coming up on 2 years in March. Prior to that, I worked for a company called Exos, formerly known as Athletes Performance, and that was more or less a private high-performance company that modeled the professional sport environment from a disciplinary team perspective in a private setting. So in working there, I was able to work with many types of athletes across pro sport as well as the military, but primarily cut my teeth working with players in the NFL or to get into the NFL via the NFL Combine process. And that's really where I fell in love with skill acquisition and motor learning. Like most necessity, I only had players for about 8 weeks from exiting college and going into the NFL to prepare them to run 40-yard dashes and do 5-10-5 and the various other physical qualities at the Combine. And what I quickly realized was that in that window, improving strength and power and other physical qualities could only take you so far. And it really was, if I can use the crude metaphor, it wasn't so much about improving the car as much as it was about improving the driver. And in that, I fell in love with coordination and skill acquisition. And really, that's informed a lot of myself as a coach, but also what I've tried to contribute from a coach education perspective. So quite a diverse and exciting background, and now I'm very honored and humbled to be able to bring those skill sets to a new sport in a new country here with Irish Rugby.
Brilliant stuff. So I'd love to sort of just delve in. I mean, obviously I watched the NFL Combine with great interest. I've spoken about it for several years, talking about talent identification and about its relative merits as a talent identification vehicle. You've been at the coalface of that, so kind of just tell me all about it. What's it like as an experience, and what do you think of its effectiveness, etc., etc.
Yeah. Well, from a historical precedent perspective, again, as we're talking about, necessity drives a lot of things. And when the NFL Combine initially came into existence, it was just a common place for which all the players could get their physicals, right, from a medical perspective. So that's how it started. And inevitably, coaches realized that, wow, this would also be a simple mechanism to capture other physical information that we feel is important, let alone be able to interview and get to know these players in one spot. So it was really born out of a requirement from a medical screening perspective, and a lot of these other things that now the Combine has become more well known for have emerged afterwards. And like most things, because there was a historical precedence for this, been very slow to change, partly because of the fact they have so much data on these fixed tests. There's individuals from an NFL perspective that are so calibrated to understanding how to evaluate players insofar as you can evaluate them from the one small piece that is the NFL Combine, that they've been slow to change. But putting that aside, what's the experience like? Well, from a player perspective, they leave college, either a junior or a senior. They get an agent, and basically the interview process is to go to the NFL Combine. And what we would do is we'd have them for 8 weeks and prepare them for this event, working on really all the physical qualities, which are assessed on more or less the last 2 days of the NFL Combine. So fast forward, once they've gone through that developmental period, whether they were at an Exos or some other kind of training facility, it's really a 4-day experience for the players, whereby they have orientation, then they go through all of their medicals. And again, that's the biggest reason the NFL Combine exists, which isn't typically publicized on TV, is they have 2 days of intensive medicals for all 32 teams to be able to poke and prod and look under the hood, so to speak, of these players. From there, they transition into very intensive interviews that is analogous to speed dating, Stuart. They get about 15 minutes with these teams, and all the teams interview these players in very different ways, which is why media training as well as interview and communication training has become all the rage with the physical development in that 8-week preparation period. And then on the final day is what's televised, obviously, on TV, and that's the 40-yard dash, the 5-10-5, the L drill, physical qualities, and then their sport-specific drills that they go through. And, I'm sure you and most of your listeners, if you've looked at it, are familiar with the data, in that the NFL Combine tests, as individual tests or even as aggregate tests, they're really not predictive of long-term success, let alone draft status. So many people have used that as the strongest critique against it, and fundamentally ask the question, why even do it if the information is not giving you insights that could help you make better decisions? And again, we've referenced that there is a historical precedent for it, and I don't deny any of those facts. There's a lot of ways to improve it. But there's a couple things that we do know about the data that comes from the NFL Combine. And that is that there are certain minimal thresholds across these various drills, whether it be the 40, the broad jump, the 5-10-5, the L drill, that you need to at least have a given ability to be successful in the NFL. So it's kind of this minimal threshold that we look at, whereby if you're above that threshold, it doesn't mean that you're going to have success in the NFL. But if you're below it, you're more than likely not going to have the physical assets required to play the game at a high level. So insofar as it's a screening just to ensure that you have the basic requisite physical requirements to play the game, it probably fulfills a purpose. But also, for me, Stuart, it's a massive social experiment, okay? And that's where you start to get a sense of the player's character, how they deal with uncertainty, how they deal with an environment that is novel, right? Do they thrive under that novelty, or do they dive, as we say? So you start to get a sense at their ability to deal with with challenge to deal with the chaos of this new environment. And you get to look at that by grading, so to speak, one player against all the other players in that exact same position under unified environmental conditions. And so I think there's value there from a subjective, perceptual perspective that maybe the data by itself doesn't give the end user who's just looking at it through that lens. So that's probably a long-winded answer, but hopefully gives you some insights into the process and what some of the teams are looking at.
No, I think that's fantastic insight, actually, because I think a lot of people, like you say, they just look at it on the surface level, and they've seen, there's been famous stories like Tom Brady, blah blah blah,
sure.
and they use that as like you say, as quite rightly as you say, as a critique of the whole process. But like you say, there's much more, if you like, under the hood going on here, beyond just the physical dimensions. That people are using that kind of that focal point as a means by which to, I suppose, it sounds to me like, from what you're saying, it's almost a way of cutting away the chaff from the wheat, more so than it is as an identification model.
Yes, because to be honest, if you're one of the 336 players invited to this, you've already been ID'd. So this already is the 1% of the 1%. All of these players can play football at a level that is of a high enough quality to play in the league. Otherwise, you're not going to be invited. What they want to see is how you then deal with this different environment and how you then physically stack up against other players in your position, knowing that some of these players come from a Division 1, some of these players come from a Division 3, some come from a West Coast conference, some come from an East Coast conference, whereby a lot of these players would have never gone up against each other. So while they're not necessarily playing a football game, which would be the most ideal way to assess this, which happens in things like the Senior Bowl, right? So that there is a mechanism to look at players from different parts of the country against each other on one playing field. This just provides another vehicle for this. And while no one's done this study, Stuart, I think probably one of the best ways to assess how the combine, at least in part, informs decision-making of coaches would be to look at what coaches expect of a player before they go into the combine, and then how the player actually performs. So independent of how fast a player is, right? Because if we're just looking at a correlational perspective, we're simply assuming that faster players are drafted higher and do better in the league, which we know on paper does not happen. But if you move away from that and you start to look at the expectation of what the coaches think the player can do, and then actually what they do at the NFL combine, independent of how fast they are, I think that players that show more than what was expected inevitably are likely drafted higher than if they just come in and meet or go below expectation. And while that's probably not absolutely the case, practically speaking, a lot of the players that I have seen break in from the third round to the second round into the first, whereby they were predicted to go later, but when they were drafted, they've gone earlier, even though they haven't played any more football, right? The only thing that's happened is they've done these individual workouts, had these interviews, and done the combine. So the only thing that you can connect to changing their draft status were things that happened between them ending college and getting drafted, the combine being one of the most notable things. And in all of those cases, Stuart, I can unequivocally say they've gone to the combine and better than what they were projected to do. And oftentimes there's a bit of luck. The guys they were evaluated against did a little bit worse, right? And it's that gap that starts to tell the coaches something new about the player that maybe they didn't see on film.
Fantastic. That's really interesting stuff.
So someone smarter than me needs to go do that study, and maybe there's something there, or maybe I'm full of it. I don't know.
I was thinking though that it sounds to me then that the combine is, if we assess the combine as being a talent identification mechanism, it isn't. It's a talent confirmation mechanism, isn't it?
That's a great way to put it, Stuart. Absolutely.
Okay. Right, well, so I mean, what I might do then is I might go back a stage then and just talk through kind of, you mentioned right at the start of this around, I love the phrase, by the way, the idea of not improving the car, but improving the driver. So kind of talk me through that from your kind of methodological process.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was just talking with one of our physios yesterday about this, so it's probably a useful place to start. So when I first started, whatever it was, 07, 08, working within the NFL Combine, there was a couple things that I noticed. First is, let's use the 40-yard dash as our skill that we're talking about here, developing. It's probably the most relevant to the list. So what I would notice is you could have 3 or 4 players present with what appeared to be the same movement error or let's say movement pattern that you felt was ideal for what we were trying to do, in this case, optimize speed over 40 yards. But for all 3 or 4 of those players presenting with the same movement error, I would find that in one case, I could just simply cue them and player A would change, but then player B might not change. So what was the disconnect? I might find that with player C, cueing also didn't work, but over the course of the 8 weeks, as they got stronger, their sprinting ability actually improved. And let's say player D, again, the cueing didn't seem to work. They were already strong enough, but they had come in with movement competencies that was picked up on an FMS or an orthopedic screen. And it was only after the physios actually did some work, opened up their hips, and functionally reintegrated that into movement, did we start to see the changes on the pitch. So from my perspective, I realized that, and I'm by no means the first person to realize this, that you could have 3 or 4 people present with what on the surface level appeared to be the same movement error, but the underpinning reason why that movement error was emerging had very distinct or different causes. So that started to get me thinking about this idea that I just simply call the 4 Ps of psychology, position, pattern, and power. And I do think it probably drives a lot of my thinking when it comes to coaching and getting at the core issue of what we're trying to coach or what we're trying to change. So let me just give those definitions. So what I mean by psychology is more or less the psychological traits, behaviors, and beliefs that they come to the table with. So for example, are they someone that has high trait anxiety, right? They're very anxious. They tend to be an overthinker. When pressure starts to hit them, they tend to go inward or they overthink, right? Does the person tend to gravitate towards this over information consumption, or are they addicted to information, thus sometimes predispose themselves to paralysis by analysis? Are they a person that doesn't like to think about anything? Thus, if you give them information, they immediately push it away, which sometimes can come across as a player that's defiant almost. So what are their psychological attributes? And that is to get into personality preferences, learning preferences, and all of these things that describe who a person is. I think those matter insofar as they affect how you want to communicate and engage with them. So having an insight into that is important. The other 3 Ps are more the mechanical side of things. So what I mean by position is quite simply, can they get into the requisite positions of the skill you're teaching? So for me, I simplify that as, do they have the requisite mobility and stability to execute flexion, extension, rotation, whatever the pattern might be, okay? From there, when we talk about pattern, let's assume they can get into flexion. If we're talking about running, let's assume they can get into extension, but do they have the coordinative ability to move through space effectively from A to B? So we know they have A and B, but can they coordinate those together effectively? And then the final one, power, is very simple. Do they have the requisite relative strength, relative power, or globally the strength qualities required to perform the skill, assuming that the skill is dependent on strength, which in this case speed absolutely is. So fast forward now, how do I address those? Well, I address the psychology one by developing meaningful relationships, studying human behavior, understanding the science of coaching, understanding the science of communication, and insofar as using that information to build better relationships, start to understand the person in front of me. Put that aside then, the other 3 Ps, we can be a little bit more mechanical in our approach. In that from a position perspective, we would have used things like the functional movement screen and a more specific orthopedic screen to strictly assess, yes or no, do they have the requisite mobility and stability across the relevant joint and movement systems in the body to perform these skills. If not, we need to have a parallel intervention from the physio or the athletic performance coach that starts to address those limitations. Okay? From a patterning perspective, absolutely, because I didn't have Vicon or any other kind of biomechanical tool, that was assessed through my subjective eye. Do they have the specific ability to perform the acceleration, the transition, the absolute speed side of the 40-yard dash? And I would use really what I call technical models that had the key parameters of effective sprinting. And I would more or less grade them across those parameters to get a subjective assessment of their coordination, so to speak. And then finally, from a power perspective, quite simple. We simply would look at their relative strength, their absolute strength, and their power in the weight room. So now if you can imagine, in particular over those last 3 Ps, I have this profile. I have this orthopedic movement screen, which gives me a sense of their base movement competencies. I have this specific assessment biomechanically and then from a coordinative perspective that I've done on their running parameters, and I have their profile in the weight room. The fact of the matter is, if they're very good in the weight room and they have no movement competency issues, I know, insofar as what that data can tell me, that it's a driver problem. And thus, they should respond really. If I see that they have an issue with their strength and or an issue with their ability stability, I know that I'm playing a little bit of a longer game here. Thus, we need to make changes to that strength and power profile, and we need to make changes to that mobility stability profile for my coaching to be optimized on the field, so to speak. That doesn't mean we don't do the sprint work. That doesn't mean we don't do the skill acquisition side of it. We absolutely do, so that we're starting to connect that perception-action coupling in terms of making sure the right thoughts are being sent to the body. But the way that those thoughts manifest in movement will only take on true form once those strength qualities are updated and once those mobility, stability qualities are updated. So as a general philosophical approach, that is how I would go through the if-then statements to make sure that training is prioritized effectively. But as we alluded to earlier, Stuart, once the issue is just in that pattern box, right? Once the issue is truly just a driver problem, that's where my interest really lies in terms of how then I can use implicit and explicit, or cues and constraints, to facilitate and guide the development of these, whether it's sprinting, passing, or catching.
And so then going sort of back to where we started from, which is, it's about less about developing the car and more about developing the driver. Do I assume from that statement that what you found over a period of time is that sort of what you might call the hardware elements, which are the power elements, the positioning elements, are the bits that are I'm trying to think about how to phrase this, because I don't want to be kind of like I don't want to be disparaging towards any of the kind of ologies here, but sort of just the power bit are the bits almost like that. You can get sorted fairly quickly, or let's say not quickly, but you know what I mean. Like I say, you can work on those sorts of things. But what you found to be the real key performance driver has been the underpinning psychology, but also that kind of pattern linked to the skill acquisition element. Is that sort of what I can infer from what you suggest?
Yeah, I think, not to use the overused pyramid, but there is a little bit of a pyramid effect here, right? In that, to your point, yes, you need the requisite physical parameters, you need the requisite movement competency parameters. Once you have those do not assume or confirm then that you will use those to the effect of optimizing your movement. How do we optimize the movement? You got to get the psychological and the patterning bits in checks. They all interconnect, but for me, the linchpin is in the pattern, and insofar as in how the psychology affects that patterning.
One of the things I'm really interested in is, and I'd be really interested to get your views on this, which is whether movement should be something that or the development of movement should be something that is that emerges as a response to the dynamics of an opponent, let's say, versus and therefore the way we develop it needs to be developed in that way, versus the development of things like strength in a kind of isolated context and then the transferability to dynamic movement. I'm still trying to sort of unravel that, really.
Well, Stuart, once you figure that out, let us all know. Because I think that's the key. So I love the scenario there, or the idea that you've presented. So maybe let's attach it to now the sport that I work in, a rugby context. So if we take a winger who is in a 5-meter channel, and for my American counterparts, we can think of a wide receiver catching a ball in open space and having a 1-versus-1 scenario with a defensive back. If this is the scenario we're in, there's a couple things, right, that have to happen. Rightly so, my decision to move in that scenario is heavily anchored to the opponent that's in front of me. And thus, my ability to know when to move, how to move, is heavily dependent on what I see, right? So is the opponent sitting low, right? Is their body position low? Are they turned in one direction? So when I initially see that player, I may get information that suggests, wow, I can go to their left shoulder and I'm going to have an advantage to score a try or score a touchdown. Or I may see them and now they're completely square. They're in a good position, right? They're picture perfect. So now I have to manufacture my own opportunity. And that's where I have to use my footwork, let's say, to try to turn the player, to try to get the player to stand up, to then manufacture the space to their left, to their right, and then attack it as such, again, with the hopes that I can score a try or score a touchdown. What's similar in both of those examples is that we first need to perceive and decide before we act. To your point, if all we ever do is work on the car and work on driving the car, but we only do that in a parking lot, and we never actually get the car on the freeway, in traffic, under the random conditions, right? No one would allow their child to learn how to drive in a parking lot and then say, okay, honey, off you go. You're ready to drive on the motorway, right, or the freeway. No one would do that. But to your point, that's how I was still trained. We do all the closed sprinting and the change of direction and the agility from an athletic performance perspective, yet we're not coupling that with the key environmental features that tell me when to sprint, how fast to sprint, when to change direction, right? It's that perception piece that precedes the action piece. So we know then that to get true transfer to the pitch, inevitably you got to go from the parking lot, you got to go to the freeway, the motorway, and equally so we have to go from just doing sprints and agility work in the contextualized scenarios of 1v1 or 1v2 or 2v3, whatever it might be, so that as we say in rugby, you start to get the pictures, you start to get the information that is required to know when to move and how fast to move. Now, with that said, I do not believe that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater here and do all training on the motorway, right? If we have a person driving on the motorway and they seem to be having very specific issues with shifting, with braking, or some other attribute, you probably are going to bring them back to the parking lot. And you're going to drill and you're going to work on those specific patterns, and then you're going to reintegrate them back into the driving, in the city on the motorway. I think that's analogous to when we see someone that has really, really good decision making. Okay, so their first step, their instinct on video replay is suggesting that they're making the right decisions. However, they continue to get caught, right? They continue to get tackled. They continue to be ineffective in exploiting that space, even though they're making that quick decision. And then I couple that information with the fact that they have a very, very poor agility ability, left and right in a 505, for example. They have very poor speed over 5 and 10 meters. Their reactive strength index is poor, and their relative strength is quite poor. Now I know, wow, I have some car-related problems here, okay? My accelerator is broken on the vehicle. And if I put some time into those closed drills, upgrading the car, I should then now give them an asset that once the decision is made, they can exploit that decision. So I don't believe it's a one or the other, they're interdependent, but probably where people are really missing the boat is they're doing too much driving in the parking lot, and they're forgetting to take the driver out into the city and out onto the motorway.
Okay. Well, now I'm going to get really into this because I think there's an interesting discussion to be had here. So my view is, and in the work I do with educating coaches towards a more of a, what you might call a ecologically driven model of skill acquisition, yes, or people you could refer to it as a games-based approach. I don't think that does it justice. But yeah, if you like this perception action concept, what I often find is, so your parking lot analogy is brilliant, because I actually think in terms of people's methodology, what to do is they could put somebody out on the freeway with all the chaos that's going on there, and they're like, oh my god, I can't possibly cope with this, and then various sort of movement patterns break down. So then we put them back in the parking lot with no cars at all. And my argument is, actually, if we take that parking lot, but we put a few cars in there, so there's still something to attend to, but without all of the chaos and huge variability of the freeway, then what we're still doing is we're still creating something a bit more representative of that. And I think people tend to jump from the kind of isolated concept to the huge level of variability. And it's too big a leap for the athlete, and that's where things break down. So there's something in between it where I'm trying to explore and play with. A lot of people jump from the safety of the parking lot to the chaos of the freeway too quickly. And actually, I actually think there's the space in between there, which is the area that I'm operating and exploring within. I'm trying to say, I'm not going to take you back to the parking lot because it's too safe for you. It's too easy. And actually, it's not going to help you to make the jump to the freeway. So I'm going to operate in a parking lot, but it's actually a parking lot with some other cars in it that you've still got to avoid and develop. So that's been my kind of mission, is to sort of say, let's kind of not go just straight back to the safety of the parking lot. Let's put people in a slightly challenging environment by using a bit of imagination, and then it'll help them perhaps make the leap to the freeway more readily.
Absolutely. And I think there's a number of really, really interesting things in that thought process. The first that jumps to mind is this whole idea presented by Dr. Guadagnoli, who is at the UNLV, University of Las Vegas, Nevada. And what he talks about is this challenge point hypothesis, in that from a motor learning or just a learning perspective in general, try and provide the right level of challenge for the person relative to their current abilities, right? So if ability is really, really high, then challenge would need to be really, really high to drive learning. However, if ability is really, really low, then challenge doesn't need to be very high to start getting that steep learning curve. But we know inevitably as ability scaffolds higher and higher and higher, and people get closer to this idea of expertise, that it's harder and harder to make those incremental gains, right? Those 1%ers. And you have to present more and more novelty, variability, or challenge to make those. And I think really what I'm hearing from you is it's about stewarding or scaffolding that process from the parking lot to the actual motorway or to the cityscape, if you would, and not having to be a one or the other, but rather have it be progressive, almost using the logic of progression and periodization from a skill development perspective. And from a layperson perspective, Daniel Coyle, in the Little Book of Talent, he talks about this kind of purposeful struggle. And when he talks about purposeful struggle, he uses this general recommendation by a percentage. So you have to excuse being successful, let's say, 60 to 80% of the time, or 50 to 70% of the time in whatever you're doing. So think of it being pass catch in rugby, could be hitting baseballs right in baseball, or a batter in bowling, whatever it might be, from a cricket perspective, are we creating a level of challenge whereby there's still fail, thus we can learn from those failures. It's not so difficult that now my competence, my self-confidence starts to get degraded, but it's not so easy that it becomes monotonous, boring, and uninteresting. And it really is about finding that sweet spot. And I think this whole idea of purposeful struggle or this challenge point is an amazing idea that can guide just about everything we do from a skill learning perspective. And that are we creating conditions that are challenging enough to keep it interesting, to drive learning, which needs the contrast of the possibility of failure, but not so easy that it's boring, or so difficult that I become disinterested or start to lose confidence from a motivational perspective. And that's what I'm hearing from you here, Stuart, and I think it's a fantastic way to approach it.
Great. By all means, I'm still exploring and I'm kind of testing a hypothesis. And the children that I coach, I describe as my kind of particularly my own children, I describe as my N=1 experiments, because I'm just exploring this concept. One interesting observation I have that I'd like to explore with you, this is from a sort of a technical development perspective, is one of the things I'm doing in dynamic games, I'm involved with field hockey, cricket, rugby, is this idea around technical development. And I have a hypothesis that I want to share with you, which is I've been developing this group of young children in hockey and deliberately not provided them with technical solutions. I've created environments within which they need to explore how they navigate. So, for example, if it's about manipulating or moving with the ball, then we've done lots of games that involve moving with the ball with opponents or moving with the ball with human obstacles to avoid. We've been doing that for quite a long period of time. And what I've observed is they actually are developing some interesting and quite novel movement solutions that I wouldn't necessarily have taught them. But what that then does, which is really interesting, is I believe it creates, and this is I've got absolutely no evidence apart from my own anecdotal observation, I believe it actually forces them to have a different kind of game appreciation. And the reason for that is they are very reliant on their teammates to be successful in the game, because they don't have all of the kind of required technical solutions in their toolbox. Therefore, there are certain things they just can't do. They can't make the ball go from one place to another, so they need a teammate to do it. So what I've noticed is they're actually more connected with their teammates and more, and certainly attempt to utilize their teammates in a kind of dynamic way, largely because they're kind of constrained by having a lack of technical capability. That means quite often we're not that successful in the competition, but I'm really interested to observe what they do. Now, I could have a huge amount of confirmation bias here. I'm really conscious of that. But I'd be interested just to get your views on kind of on that.
So really, I'd like to share maybe two ideas that popped to mind as you were explaining that may give further credence to the hypothesis. The first one comes from my work in my PhD on attentional focus. In that, let's just use golf for an example. We know, and I use golf because probably there's the largest sum of evidence about this particular area, and that is when they look at golfers. If we have three types of cues, let's say, where if we're trying to get a more pendulum-like action, and excuse me for all the golf pros there, Stuart, I know you dabble in golf as well, so if I'm getting this incorrectly, please excuse the crudeness of my example. But if, let's say we're trying to get a more pendulum smooth downstroke during the golf swing. So we could reference, let's say, the arms as the point. We could reference the club as the reference point, or let's say we could also reference the outcome, thus the trajectory of the ball, let's say, or the endpoint of the ball, where we want to go, or maybe if we're really successful, the ability to put spin on the ball in the air, to have it curve to the left, curve to the right. Okay, so we have those three areas, and we can almost think of it like a zoom lens, whereby we're either zooming in or we're zooming out. Classically in the literature, we consider the arm cue to be an internal cue. We consider the club cue to be a close or a more proximal type cue, and then the trajectory or the endpoint being more of your distal external cue or the far external cue. So we have these three levels. And what we know is if you take a bunch of novices, at least insofar as the current research, we have a pretty good idea that cueing the movement of the club will allow for better accuracy than cueing the arm action, right? So in that case, it saves that zooming out 1 degree from the arms to the club itself has a benefit. And there's a lot of reasons we can get into if you'd like to, but we'll keep it that simple for now. Now, interestingly enough, if we take a group of experts and we have them do those same three movements with the arms, the club, and the trajectory or the endpoint, where we want the ball to physically land on the green, let's say, we know that the club is still better than focusing on the arm action, but we now also know that focusing on the trajectory of the endpoint is even more improved from a performance perspective than focusing on the club itself. So there's kind of this distance effect that gets closer and closer to the outcome of the skill. Because really, what is the outcome? The outcome is to put the ball as close to the hole as possible. And it seems that as you become more expert-like, you gain this ability to focus farther and farther and farther away from the movement process, whereby the outcome itself, if focused on, drives the correct movement pattern. So in part, what I'm hearing as the first example is that when I'm playing a team sport and we're dealing with this dynamic, coordinated system whereby each of the players on the pitch is kind of like each joint in the body, inevitably, I need to start to learn how to utilize my other teammates as an extension of my movement landscape. So in this case, the pass is a more ideal outcome than trying to, let's say, make the shot or do something myself. They become an extension of my own movement parameters in a similar way that as I start to become more expert-like, I can focus farther and farther away from the body. So that's one thing that I may be trying to make a bridge there that doesn't completely work, but there seems to be some level of coherence between those two ideas from a skill development perspective. And the other thing is Richard Dawkins talks about this idea of an extended phenotype when he talks about genes. So from a completely different arena, in that, like, not only do we look at how genes give rise to how tall you are, right, your eye color, your hair color, so on and so forth, but genes in the case of, let's say, a bird would also give rise to having the requisite skill sets to make a nest for which to grow a family. And even though that nest is outside of the body, it takes on this idea of a quality like hair color or like height that is requisite or important for that, in this case, the bird's survival. So it's taking this idea whereby movement behavior needs to be considered in terms of the environment, in addition to what lives between the head and the heel, and that the environment can be an extension of our movement behavior, even though it falls inside the walls of our skin. And I think that's what you're getting at here. And I believe there's both biological creators, and there also is examples from other areas of skill development from an attentional focus perspective.
Which is, it's absolutely fascinating. And I'm reading a really interesting book at the moment called The Gene and Intimate History by Siddhartha Mukherjee. I probably butchered his name.
It's on. No, you said it right. It's on my desk. Very. I haven't started it yet, so you're ahead of me there. But it's under great recommendation. I've heard it's a phenomenal book.
Well, I first heard him speak on Sam Harris's podcast, and actually I found him absolutely.
So did I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a great read. So I won't spoil it for you, but there's some fantastic information. He's a brilliant writer, actually. But actually, in many ways, I've had almost exactly the same kind of thoughts. Reading that book and actually linking it to the idea of the extended phenotype that Dawkins talks about. And I think I might be guilty of this. It's I think Daniel Kahneman talks about the availability heuristic. So everywhere I look now, I'm embarked on this sort of ecological journey. Everywhere I look, I kind of see examples of that kind of ecological dynamics at play.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, even if there is a little bit of an availability or a confirmation bias going on. From a practical perspective, this idea of developing a skill learning environment whereby players get used to knowing implicitly how to use their teammates effectively based on various situations and various contexts. I think in principle, that absolutely is a critical idea, and one that is expressed in play of the best team sports, whatever the sport might be. You know, there was a video that was just put on Twitter the other day from the NBA referencing kind of synchronous action with the 5 players. I don't know if you've seen this yet, Stuart, whereby someone catches a rebound and literally in the most eerie sense, everybody turns, their first foot contact and their acceleration down the court happens almost in complete harmony as if it was, you know, pre-practiced ahead of it. And just it was used as an example of synchrony in dynamic systems. So I think the fact of the matter is the best players and the best teams operate almost as a single organism if the parts are interconnected. So using that as a heuristic for the way you approach skill development, I think is brilliant, because I see it all the time in sport, as I'm sure you and many of the listeners do, whereby you will see a player that is in a 1v1 scenario. In rugby, right, you always have this option of, am I going to run or am I going to pass? And if they're not scanning, if they're not seeing everything around them, they may decide to run when the pass was on. And if they had made that pass, that person had a 5-meter gap and they're scoring a try. But oftentimes players get into tunnel vision. And if we're only working on that player's decision-making with just the opponent they see or just their own abilities, but they're not extending that decision-making to understanding the other variables of their own teammates, right, and understanding how to use that teammate as an extension of their movement behavior. If we're not creating the opportunities to learn that, have that be part of your decision framework, then we're probably limiting ourselves as a team and limiting the player.
I think it's really interesting, and I think one of the things I've been I think for a long time we've, you know, championed the idea of fundamental movement skill, but also championed the idea of sort of fundamental sport skills. I actually think the concept of fundamental movement skills has been superseded by fundamental sport skills. However, that's a different debate. But what I've seen is then, because we've sort of had this focus on, you know, we must give young players techniques so that they can play the game, so that they can compete. I think what that then does is, it, like you say, it sort of makes them a little bit, almost a bit myopic in terms of actually performing those techniques. And whereas if they don't have those techniques, they have to find alternative solutions, which makes them more appreciative of their teammates. And therefore they develop almost a kind of an implicit understanding of what the movement dynamics for the team should be. And I almost think so by developing an appreciation of the game and then layering onto that technique later on, once they've developed the game appreciation, I think it would be a really powerful model, but I just don't really see it done anywhere.
Do you think it has to? Can it be done in parallel? Do you think?
Well, yeah, I think it can, because obviously what happens is players find themselves sort of getting stuck, and so they're looking for a solution, and they'll try and explore different solutions. And you might need to offer them or present them with opportunities. You know, present them with opportunities to explore different solutions. So it's just where you know, what the likes of technical shaping might come in. But you're doing that as a way to solve the problem, or guiding them to solve the problem, as opposed to, here's a solution. At some point, you're probably going to need this solution, so just wait for the right time.
So it would almost be having a mathematics class where the whole day is just getting answers, and you have no idea what problem that answer is solving. Right, that is almost the metaphor here, and that would be quite an odd mathematics class, right? It would just be a bunch of numbers on a screen, and that's really almost what we're doing if we're developing these fundamental movement skills or these fundamental sport skills outside of the context of decision making that necessitates that skill to be used in the first place. Now, I think that's the whole idea of action coupling. Right, and that the coupling of it that's the hard problem, right? That's the one that we're trying to improve. And how much time do we spend decoupling those, right? assuming that they are like magnets and will just come back together. And I think you bring up a great point that if we develop decision making in VR, in isolation of that ability to do the skill, right, in isolation on the pitch, we can't just assume that those two things will go together. There is a skill in connecting and timing that connection. And that's what I'm hearing from you, Stuart. And I think you're spot on. And insofar as the way I now approach speed and agility development, on days that we label as agility or multi-directional, I'm now to the point where I try to execute all of our movement skills, even in the warm-up, in a 1-versus-1 scenario. So you're either going forward and back, side to side, angular, and you always get 2 reps. One is the leader, one is the follower. So they're still hitting all of the core skills that I feel are important. They're doing it under the duress of still having to make a decision and be able to pick perceptually up on the cues of the body in front of them to decide to go forward, back, side to side, rotate, or sprint. And I found that to be quite valuable because I believe, especially in sport, we have such limited time with the players. The more time we can spend where perception, action is coupled, and good quality coaching is driving the improvements of these movement competencies, we're probably putting the player in the best position to transfer that training back to the pitch.
And from a motivational standpoint and the sort of self-determination theory, my idea there or thinking there is that there's nothing quite like if the player identifies a movement limitation that they need to solve, then they're going to be, I think, more intrinsically motivated to try and solve that problem when they've discovered it for themselves than if someone comes along and says, here's a movement pattern that you're going to need at some point, really work on this because it'll make you better.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, Stuart, because I can imagine there'd be listeners out there thinking, well, guys, what happens when you're doing this kind of decision-based context, this ecologically valid training environment that always keeps the perception action coupling together in terms of the scenarios you're presenting, 1v1, 1v2, whatever it might be. What happens when I see a player that their movement solution, their answer to the problem is incorrect, right? Their physical ability to answer the question in front of them, in this case, moving around a defender, let's say, is ineffective, maybe in quality or capacity. How do we address that?
Well, actually, that's kind of why I like your 4Ps model in many ways.
Okay.
What that does is it almost gives you kind of a diagnostic to be able to say, right, so where's the rate limiter as they use
yes.
in the literature? Where's the limiting factor here? Is it actually that you just don't believe that you can achieve, or you're just too anxious to try and perform the movement because you're essentially scared of failure? Or is it you just physically can't get yourself into the required position to be able to execute the movement effectively? Or first and foremost, have you this is the other point, is have you perceived the problem in a way that is kind of forcing you to make a certain movement that actually is a suboptimal movement, and maybe it's a problem with perception. But then
yes.
Coming back to what you were saying earlier on around kind of coordination and spatial awareness, it might be a coordination factor there. It might be just somebody's just unable to sort of put all the different moving parts together in the right sequence to be able to move that forward. And then finally, does it just come down to, the engine isn't producing enough torque to be able to, for us to be able to sort of put the required revs in place to be able to do the movement? Now, the likelihood is it's probably a combination of all of those. But what you can do, I'm assuming, using those 4Ps is to say, right, which one do we need to attend to immediately that will act as a kind of as a building block to the others?
Absolutely. No, and I think that's where I constantly, within my own practice and when presenting to other coaches, talk about then the 5th P, which is prioritization. Right? So once you have that kind of that diagnostic heuristic or mental model, if you would, to approach identifying the limiter, then you need to be able to prioritize time. And I visited a number of clubs, as well as some of the things we're trying to do in Irish Rugby, is having kind of this idea of top-ups or a priority day. What is your priority? Where at least once a week, if not more, are we able to work on that specific rate limiter for you, so that sits parallel to these other key exposures that we know relate more heavily to play in the sport. So I think that's fantastic, and your view would align with mine.
I heard a great phrase from a colleague here at Fourth England. She said, priority is never a word that should be used in plural.
Yes, absolutely. It needs to be individualized 100%.
And I think the point you make there is that I think we're trying to, generically improve the performance of a player by kind of hitting all the angles. And this is where I think the ologies come in, because everybody wants to sort of do their bit to help you with the improvement. And don't get me wrong, I think that's absolutely fine. But I actually think it needs to be much more purposeful than that, because if you've gone through your diagnostic here and identified what the priority is, then everybody's focus should be looking at how we can improve that particular priority. I think it's even more powerful, and maybe this is a sixth P, which is person, which is if that person is actually making the choices, this is my priority.
Yep, absolutely. And that's really interesting, because there's a layer above or within everything that we're talking about, and you've now hit on it twice, and that is motivation. So, my philosophy around skill learning is first and foremost, we only get better at what we attend to. And we tend to only focus or attend to things that we find interesting, and said differently, we are motivated to attend to. And without going on a massive tangent into motivational theory, we know that one of the key tenets of motivation is this psychological need or desire to have causality or control of yourself and your environment insofar as you can control it. And we use this word autonomy. And thus, with all of the things that we're talking about here, I think we could go back and to pinpoint examples whereby we involve the player in the decision-making of drill creation, in decision-making around cue identification, in the decision-making of singular priority identification. And in doing that, they become a business partner, taking us out of that boss position, right? We're now working together to have a shared journey to help solve a problem for which they put their hand up and say, I'm motivated to solve. We need to involve them in that. So 100%, for me, motivation is the battery pack attention, which is the currency of learning.
Perfect. And for me, the other dynamic at play here is the coach. Because I know we've got a number of different people here who are acting as coaches, and they have let's say a subject specialism, and they have a contribution to make. And I think it's incumbent upon coaches, particularly working in whatever context, to have a really strong and broad understanding of all these different dimensions, because in many cases, the athlete isn't always in the best position to be able to determine the different elements that should be, or the element that should be attended to. And so they can easily get sort of buffeted around in the wind. And I've seen athletes on the talent journey, kind of one person will say you need to do this, and another person will say you need to do this, and they're not always congruent. So I think sometimes the coach acts as almost like the filter, and says to the particular specialist, not right now, it's not the priority. We're focusing here, or yes, but our priority is here. So I know that needs to be done at some point, but we're just focusing on this. So how can you contribute to that? And that's a bit that's overlooked. I think for me, a lot of coaches are just one of the spokes in the wheel instead of being wrapped around the athlete themselves.
No, it's interesting. We had Raf Brandon over from the English Cricket Board a couple weeks ago, and we had a workshop on interdisciplinary teamwork, which, to your point, it's not probably talked about enough. And putting attention in and around how we operate that backroom high performance unit that encapsulates the player is critical. And I'm going to freestyle off a quote that he said. So this is not an exact quote, but the spirit of the quote comes from him. And that is, sometimes what is best for the athlete is not giving them your best. And what he meant by that is, if you're a strength coach, let's say, but that person's core problem relates to the catch and the pass from a rugby context, not having those extra speed sessions, maybe not having that extra strength session to allow them either the time and or the energetic reserves to spend a bit more time working on the catch, working on the pass. That would be what's best for the athlete, even though as the strength coach in that example, you're not giving them your best. And I think that's what's key, is that we need to have zero ego, and the whole concept of prioritization needs to happen at the interdisciplinary team level, looking at not only within each unit, but across the various disciplines. What is that singular, that number one priority for the player, and how can we allocate them the time to do work on it?
And then I think the other rationale there is that we're talking about, like you say, an academy context or something like that, where you do have an interdisciplinary team. But if you go lower down into the community space, but you're still working with a developing athlete, the coach is the interdisciplinary team.
Yes, that's a
so
fair
again,
point.
Even more important that they have this broad understanding of all these different dimensions.
So, Stuart, let me ask you a question, because in this whole concept of an ecological approach to coaching, and as you've given the various names, whether it's constraint-led, games-based, it comes through various guises, but nonetheless, we're talking about creating a context that is relevant to the game and allowing patterns to emerge through these exposures almost implicitly. Where, in your opinion, is explicit coaching through the forms of cues, instruction, feedback, where does that sit within your viewpoint around skill development? How do you balance that with ensuring that we're giving them the headspace to problem solve, and we're not giving them the answers, let's say, with too much information from a coaching perspective?
You've just, I think, hit upon my probably biggest developmental area.
Okay.
Because I think most of us, when we go into coaching, usually we've got some kind of analytical mind, or we're problem solvers. We're built to serve, aren't we? And we want to help people. That's kind of how we're made. And so often when people present with some kind of a problem, or they don't even know the problem, you've spotted the problem, because that's what we do. We look at stuff and we see problems. Then what we end up doing is we jump in and say, hey, I can help. And I think sometimes we're far too quick to do that. Just because I think what we're doing is, and I say this a lot on the coach education stuff, is I think we're robbing kids and players of really valuable learning opportunities, because we come in with the answer. It's like, when my son's doing his math problem, to use your analogy earlier on, he's just about to try and work out what, kind of 16 multiplied by 16 is, and I just jump in. I'm not even going to give you the answer, because I don't know why I used that as an example, because my maths is terrible.
I was going to say, Stuart, what's the answer? We'll put you on the spot here, because I have no idea.
Neither do I. But the point is that we jump in with answers, when the value is in the struggle, isn't it? So the way I've evolved my coaching in the last 3 to 4 years, I suppose, is to avoid stepping in with an explicit instruction or example, but instead to help the athletes draw attention to something. So, for example, I might use an environmental constraint, I might use a task-based constraint, a rule, I might use something else, or I might do something with the opponent that then sort of guides the individual towards that. Now, that's not to say that we don't use an explicit approach at all, because like anything, I would be mad to say that. And actually, there are opportunities, I think, through really effective questioning to draw attention again to the problem and help the individual. Just the problem you often have is there's too many potential solutions, there's too much variability. So what you tend to do through your questions maybe is just focus on, put a spotlight on something, and then say, just see what do you notice about that, and then see if they can come up with the solution. And again, then you can become a little bit more tweaked and a little bit more tweaked. So I suppose using, I guess, a blend between the two, but trying to avoid wherever possible jumping in and telling. That's not to say I don't ever, because sometimes they're just struggling too much, and so you sometimes need to help. But I'm trying to avoid myself going there for as long as possible, if that makes sense.
No, it does, and I think what is interesting, I'll sometimes maybe to poor effect, but say that psychology trumps motor learning. And what I mean by that is, again, it goes back to what we said earlier. If we believe that motivation in its various forms drives attention, the second we lose their mind, right? The second we lose their interest, we lose their motivation, then we've lost their attention. And once we've lost their attention, it doesn't matter how effective our drills are or how effective the learning environment is, they're not going to gain from it what we're intending for them to gain. So for me, sometimes, insofar as explicit coaching can, yes, as you've discussed it, help drive the skill learning process, I think it's also our primary medium in many ways to guide motivation through discussion, through questioning. Sometimes, they might be tired, and just when we've identified it, it might be best just to give them a simple cue and allow them to focus on it, especially if we know that cue is more than likely to give them some success. So when we see that the environment is becoming too much, the challenge is becoming too challenging, whereby we're starting to see them recede from a motivation and an attentional perspective. Sometimes explicit coaching tactics can actually have a motivational efficacy to them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but again, like anything, it's a bit like sugar or salt. They're really overused, and actually they can be quite sort of negative potentially if they're overused.
Yes. No, I completely agree. I think the hard part, and this is the art of the science, is knowing how to balance the two together. I always tell people there's plenty of science in coaching, but the art is when, where, why, and how to use each tool.
Exactly. The blending of the art and the science is what I refer to as the craft.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree.
And so I like the analogy of a craftsman, actually, because, or a craftswoman or a craftsperson, because I love the idea that there is obviously there is skill, and there is, like you say, it's about refining your use of the various tools that are at your disposal. You can use a hammer, you can use a chisel, you can use a very, very fine file or whatever it is if you're sculpting something. And I think that analogy kind of sort of seems to resonate with me.
What do you think, Stuart, has been the rate limiter, to use that term again, in the uptake of this information into pro sport, and then obviously inevitably down into to more domestic sport and into physical education systems in schools? And I frame the question from two conversations I've had in the past with both Mark Williams and Damien Farrow and others, who agree that despite the level of evidence and how long the research, both empirically and practically, is pointing to the efficacy of a lot of the things we're discussing here across implicit and explicit learning, the global uptake of this information and the availability of this information still seems to be quite limiting in the way, if you were to go to the conventional practice and watch it take form or listen to the coach, they'd be doing the things that go strongly against what a lot of the evidence and practical insights we're talking about now suggest. Why do you think that the uptake has been so slow?
I think there's a number of factors here. So, but I agree. I think actually it has been a pretty slow burn, hasn't it? I mean, interestingly though, what I'm now observing is lots of governing bodies, in particular, embracing these approaches, to a lesser or greater extent.
Yes.
I think the bit that they're missing though is the education that's required. So, interestingly, in terms of coach education, certainly over here in the UK, it's been a fairly linear education model, quite based on kind of formal learning practice and assessments, and based on sort of the assessment of competency as opposed to expertise. And I think then the learning and development then goes beyond qualification, is sorely lacking. It's like a huge void. I also think, interestingly, before I started this podcast, I would have probably been a little bit more negative about, I would have sort of shared some of the, but interestingly, the responses I'm getting to the podcast and some of the people coming through to me, and I actually think there's a groundswell of people who almost have been looking for an alternative to their existing practices, and are actually really open to the idea of this. I think there's just been a real lack of. I just think the science hasn't been people haven't been able to translate the science into kind of practitioner speak, which is, if you like, one of the reasons I set this up, because I wanted to just have conversations with practitioners such as yourself, but obviously people who are grounded in the scientific stuff, but they're trying to apply this scientific stuff practically, to then hopefully get some of those stories shared with the people on the ground. Hopefully then it would resonate more, and then they begin that process. And then the final piece is a quote I heard recently, which was about the skill that's required to operate this way. It's really easy to operate in a reductionist way, break stuff down into isolated parts, work in isolated movement patterns, these sorts of things. I actually think that's a relatively logical and straightforward way of working. In many ways, what we're doing here is almost a bit counterintuitive, and also you don't see results at the end of a session necessarily. In fact, sometimes you see regression. So it's kind of it feels wrong, it feels wrong to work this way sometimes. And so as a result, those factors combined, and by no means an exhaustive list, I think have meant that it's one of those things that becomes it's a slow development. And so, sorry, that quote I was going to use was somebody said to me, is operating using kind of an ecological model is it a jet that only test pilots can fly? Now, I don't believe it is, because interestingly, when I educate absolute novice coaches in this approach, they absolutely love it. It demystifies things for them. They go, what do you mean I don't have to have all this technical knowledge? I don't have to have played at National League to be a coach. No, actually, you just need to understand the problems that the game is throwing at kids, and then design some games and help them navigate them. Wow, I can do that. Yeah. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think you bring up a really, really valuable point, and I completely agree. Despite the negative connotation of the question, I do believe that we are very quickly on a rise point right now. Maybe not at the tipping point, but I think getting closer, whereby these themes are starting to come in vogue, and people are more and more aware of them at a general level across personal training and across strength conditioning and sport. So I definitely agree. And now, having moved over to this part of the world, I definitely believe that the themes are more, let's say, part of coaching language, to a far greater degree than they are in the States, but everywhere I've seen is improving. But one thing that I believe is critical, and you hit on it, that is the translation. Inevitably, through translation, we're talking about developing a vocabulary and developing a terminology related to this ology, right? This domain that we can just generally call skill development. And what I've found is when I go into various areas, of which you're spot on, a lot of them are national governing bodies, teaching them this information and helping them develop a vocabulary of, right, implicit learning, explicit learning, internal cues, external cues, constraint-led approach, environment, task, body. We start to, if you would, dust off the fossil, bringing it into high definition. And once they have this vocabulary, they can now coach an hour-long session, take 5 minutes to do their reflective practice to say, did I give more statements? Did I use more questions? Was I primarily using internal cues? Was I using external cues? Was I giving feedback 100% of the time? Was I giving feedback 50% of the time? Were my constraints effectively? Did I constrain the right parameters, space, time, rules, equipment, perception? Once we give them this vocabulary, they can actually now look back at their session and define what they want to keep, right? What they want to discard, and what they want to add interchange in the next session. And I think the more we move towards defining that vocabulary, that translational work, the faster this information will make it into practice.
That's absolutely fantastic, and I think that's a brilliant way of, if you like, summarizing the conversation, because I think like you say, that is, I think the starting point around coach education needs to be different. So the starting point for most coach education programs are, these are the techniques of our game, and this is how you teach them. And actually, the change needs to be, right, this is how you develop an individual in any domain. These are the various tools at your disposal. You can become better at these or worse at these, and you can play with those. This is how you develop somebody. And then, oh, by the way, there's a game to play here, and here's some of the problems that the game presents. And what we need to do is help young people using this to navigate those problems. Now, you may at some point need a technical solution, and actually we can learn about that as you need it. But actually right now, starting point, let's just try solve some problems together.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I was going to say is that the other thing I was going to say to coaches a lot is, you're not going to break them. If you try a different constraint or something and it doesn't really work out, it's not the end of the world. You're not going to break them. Having said that, if you were to give somebody the wrong technical solution, the wrong technical model, or the wrong movement model, it takes quite a long time to unpick that, and you know that because you've been at the goalface.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. It's almost in one thing, bringing this generalized logic to sport. I'm not a sport coach, but what it does allow you to do is work with sport coaches that have the knowledge. And what I've almost tried to do is apply the 4P model as a heuristic or as a metaphor for then figuring out what's the equivalent 4P model, right? Or maybe it's the 4A model, whatever it might be, for your sport. In that, look at the global tactics of your sport, break it down into the key scenarios, and then the requisite decisions that live within each of those scenarios. And inevitably, once you start to have that tactical map, is the term that I use, it then allows you to be much more focused in your application of the principles that we're discussing. But, to effectively develop skill, you need to first understand what you're trying to develop. And I think defining that tactical map, just like defining a technical model for a skill, is always step one. Then you start to anchor these strategies to developing those requisite technical, tactical type skills. So I think it's key.
Awesome. Nick, that's been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I love the fact that, I was kind of asking you questions, you were asking me questions. I think that's great. And we had a really valuable conversation. I'm certain that people who listen to this podcast is going to find loads of golden nuggets. I've certainly taken one away. The 4 Ps is going to stay with me. I'm stealing that, whether you like it or not.
I'm sure I stole it from 4 other people. So.
It's like Guardiola says, isn't it? He says, we're all just thieves as coaches.
Absolutely.
Anyway, I'm really appreciative of your time, and I'm also appreciative of the fact that we had to have a couple of goes at this. But I think it was really worthwhile by the end of it.
No worries, Stuart. Thanks so much. I have deep appreciation for individuals like yourself who take the time to create these opportunities for discussion and share them with the rest of us. So keep it up.
And so where can people find out more about your work and where you're going to be next if they wanted to come and listen to you speak or whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. So at this point, I'm still dealing with the Twitter sphere. So at Nick Winkelman is all one word is my handle. I put everything up there, but I should have a website out. I've been saying that for a couple of years, but I should have a website out in the coming year to help people find a bit more about what I'm trying to do. And as Sam Harris says, thinking out loud, which I absolutely love. But at Nick Winkelman on Twitter is the easiest place to find me.
Awesome. Great, Nick. Well, I really appreciate that. Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Stuart.